Hi. Hi, good evening, students. How are you? I hope you all must be fine, healthy, and enjoying your learnings these days. Okay. Myself, Mehraj, but I am the professor of the botany, and today I want to discuss with you some of the topics like cell division, and the cell cycle to give you the more clarity about the concept. And also I will discuss about the some questions which has come from the topic in the NEET 2020. Okay, so we'll give you the clarity about these things. Now let me take you through first. If we take the concept cell, for example, now what is the cell? First we need to understand what the cell is. Okay, now in the simple manner, what is the cell? I will give the example of how the building is going to be built up. When we develop the building, then in that building we require the number of the materials like bricks, stones, iron, sand. Okay, all of these are what? They are materials. But those materials, they remains the unit for that building. So in the same manner, for all the living organisms, there is the basic unit. That basic unit is called the basic fundamental and structural unit of all the living organism, that is called the cell. So cell is the basic unit of all the living organisms. That means all living organisms have been made up of by this cell. Okay. Now what is the difference? If I will tell you what is the difference between the living cell and the dead cell, both are the cells, then how can you differentiate between a living cell and a dead cell? For example, if I will give you the choice, there is a one cell, there is another cell, cell A, cell B. This cell, how can we say that cell 1 is living and cell 1 is dead? What is that thing which makes the cell living and a dead? Okay, what is that? That is simply a cell, any cell having the presence of the living substance called the protoplasm, called the protoplasm of the cell. The cytoplasm and nucleus of the cell is known as protoplasm. Any cell having the presence of the protoplasm will be considered as the living cell, and any cell which doesn't contain that will be considered as the dead cells. Okay, so that is the, in a simple manner, how can we understand the concept of the cell? So that is why the cell is called the basic fundamental and structural unit of all the living organisms. Now when we talk about the cell, then there is a concept called cell division. Okay, cell division. Now if we talk about the cell division, what is the cell division? Cell division is simply a process by which a single cell considered as a parental cell is divided into the two or multiple number of the cells, two or more than two daughter cells, and that is called the cell division. That parental cell get divided into the two daughters or more than two daughter cells is called the cell division. Now, why this cell division is occurring? Why the cell has to divide? Do you know that? Do you know why the cell has to divide? Why there is a necessity of this cell to divide? Now, there are many factors, there are the many theories, there are many theories which suggested that there are some reasons why the cell has to divide. Like, for example, I will give you that if there is a cell, for example, single cell, if the organism is made up of by this cell, then all the organisms would have been single, unicellular type. Then if all organisms would have been unicellular type, then the cell would have been grown enormously. So when it grows extended way, then what will happen then? Then at certain point, this cell would not have maintained its surface area and volume ratio, that it might have burst. Then the living organisms might not have been evolved so far. So there would not have been so lifelong for the living organisms. Then there would have been a short lifespan of the living organisms. That is how there are the reasons why the cell has to divide, because of its maintenance or balancing of its surface area and the volume ratio cell has to divide. Also, inside the cell, its nucleus and cytoplasm. The balance between the nucleocytoplasmic ratio, to maintain that, also has to cell has to divide itself to maintain that cytoplasmic ratio. Also, this inside the cell, it is called that genetic material, the genome of the cell, it is going to be replicated, and that triggers the cell to divide. That is also the another factor which trigger the cell to divide into the division. These are some of the factors by which the cell can be divided, okay, that can be triggered. Now, cell division, when this division occurs, when the cell is going to divide, that is the point. Now these are all, there are the various phases, there are the various events which occur before the cell is going to divide itself, okay. So then series of these, all the events that occur by which the cell prepares itself, grows itself, and then divide itself, then those, all these series of events is known as cell cycle. That is known as cell cycle. So what is cell cycle? Let me explain you diagrammatically here. Look at this diagram, okay. This is the diagrammatic representation of the cell cycle. For example, the human cell, okay, human cell. Now, if we talk about cell cycle, that means how much time is taken by the cell to divide itself from one to become, from single cell to daughter cells, from one cell to two cells, okay, how much time it takes. So all these series of events together is called a cell cycle. So this cell cycle is variable from organism to organism, it is variable, and also it is from cell type to type is also variable. Say for example, if I give you the example of yeast cell, okay, yeast cell, the yeast cell divides in every 90 minutes. It has the cell cycle time 90 minutes. Similarly, if we take human cell every 24 hours get divided, okay. So that is how it is variable from organism to organism and from cell to cell. Now, cell cycle, the cell cycle has the number of the phases. That means a parental cell, it undergoes number of phases by which it prepares itself completely to get divide itself, and all these phases together is known as the cell cycle, okay. Now, what are the different phases of the cell cycle? Look at this diagram here. There are mainly three phases in the cell cycle. There are mainly three phases of cell cycle. One phase, it is called interphase. Interphase is the largest phase of the cell cycle. Then second phase is called mitosis, mitotic phase, and third is called cytokinesis. This is actually the part of the mitosis, after mitosis happening. So these are the three phases of the cell cycle by which the cell cycle is going to be completed in these phases. Now let me take you through in the first phase called the interphase of the cell cycle, okay. Now interphase is the largest phase which gets started here, from here to all these phases which you can see diagrammatically. This is called interphase. These all stages are called the interphase. Now in this interphase there are different sub phases. This interphase is going completed into sub phases as well, not in a continuous manner. So this is the largest phase of the cell cycle. Almost 43% of the time taken is taken by the interphase itself, okay, remember that. Now what is happening in the interphase? The first sub phase of the interphase here gets started. Say for example, there is a cell, this cell has entered into the first phase of interphase called the G1 phase. This is called the G1 phase here, or first gap phase, or first gap phase. It is also called the post mitotic gap phase, after the mitosis happened. Now in this G phase, what is happening? The cell which is here to prepare itself, this cell, it prepares all the proteins, RNAs, necessary proteins, RNAs, and it various duplicates the various organelles, cell organelles, except certain major organelles like mitochondria, chloroplast, and centrioles. They are not going to be duplicated in the G1 phase here. Remember this point, okay? So only some of other cell organelles, they are going to be duplicated. Necessary proteins as well as RNA, they are going to be synthesized in this phase to remain it active as the cells will grow there and prepare themselves for the next phase. Okay, that is what is happening in the G1 phase. Now in this G1 phase only, later I will tell you the question which was based on this phase here. Now remember here, in this G1 phase, the cell which is entered here in the G1 phase, there are the two conditions happening in the G1 phase. One side, one cell, the cell which has prepared all the synthesized all the properties, it has synthesized all the necessary proteins, RNAs, and become full-fledged to proliferate and become full-fledged. It is ready for the next phase to enter into the S phase then in the next phase. Okay, so this cell is completely full-fledged. Now there are some cells here in the G1 phase. These cells, they do not synthesize all the necessary proteins and constituents by which they have to divide. So they are not going to remain proliferative here. They do not take part in the division, further division. So these cells, they remains beside in here in the one of the resting phase, that is called the G0 phase or G0 phase. It is called quiescent phase also. Now this quiescent phase is a resting phase, but it is metabolically active phase. The cell which remains in this phase, they are the active cells, metabolically active, but not proliferative. They do not take part in the proliferation of the cell. Remember this point. So in that way, the cells which will not take part in the further proliferation will differentiate actually here. So they will take part in the differentiation here. So these cells, when they differentiate here, they get differentiated into two categories. Some of the cells get differentiated temporarily and some of the cells get differentiated permanently. So some cells will get differentiated completely for the whole lifetime period, will get differentiated, and they are known as permanent differentiated cells. Say for example the brain cells, heart cells, okay, they get completely differentiated. Similarly, in case of the plants, differentiated cells, meristematic, some epidermis, endodermis, these are the differentiated cells. And temporary, some cells remains temporarily here for the certain period of the time, and after that, if there is a need of the organism, they get work on call. If they get a call that there is a need of this cell, that cell which is in the temporary phase will come out from the temporary phase of the G0 phase and will take part in further proliferation in the G1 phase. So they can take part further in the proliferation phase. They remains temporarily in this phase, like certain liver cells or kidney cells are in the temporary phase. Okay, so remember, this is the important point. The G0 phase, quiescent phase, is actually the part of the G1 phase, within the G1 phase only. And there are the two types of differentiation occurs, temporary differentiation and permanent differentiation of the cells. Remember this point, that is happening here in the G1 phase. Okay. Now further, the cell which is ready now to the next phase, that will enter into the S phase. This S phase is called the synthetic phase. Okay, and in this synthetic phase, the cell synthesizes the DNA here. It replicates the DNA. The DNA is going to be duplicated here. Okay, so the amount of genome is going double here in the cell. If the cell has the amount of DNA here 2C, for example, then when the cell enters into the S phase, its DNA amount goes become to 4C. Okay, that is how the DNA is going to be double in the cell, but number of chromosome remains the same, that doesn't change. So that is the most important change occurring in the S phase, and the necessary protein called histone proteins will be synthesized in the S phase here itself. That is the major function in the S phase. Now cells in the S phase will now enter into the another phase called G2 phase. This is called the gap 2 phase. Okay, gap 2 phase. Now this gap 2 phase is almost similar to G1 phase. Here also the synthesis of necessary proteins occur. The proteins get synthesized, RNA gets synthesized, as well as there is the duplication of these some major organelles like mitochondria, chloroplast, which I told they are not going synthesized here, they are going synthesized here. But remember the point, centriole, the centriole gets duplicated in S phase. Remember here, it goes duplicated in S phase, neither in G1 phase nor in the G2 phase. These are the some of the important points where the questions are coming in the NEET examinations. Okay, remember these points. Fine, these are very important and based on the NEET examination. Now there was a question in the NEET examination in NEET 2020. I will read out the question. Question was, some dividing cells exit the cell cycle and enter the vegetative stage, inactive stage. This is the quiescent stage or G0 stage. And this process occurs at the end of which phase? And the options were M phase, G1 phase, S phase, and G2 phase. And that is the right now which I have shown you. There is the answer lies here. That means those cells get exit after the G1 phase. So the right answer will be the G1 phase. Okay, remember this point here. Such type of questions are coming in the NEET, which are the very important. So you should know about the clarity about the concept. Okay, this is how the interphase is going to be completed in the life cycle. After the interphase, there is the mitotic phase, and after the mitotic phase, there is the cytokinesis. I hope you got the answer of this question of the NEET 2020. Okay, and next, if I get the chance, I will take you through the whole concept of this cell cycle. Till then, thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thank you. Good night.